So welcome everybody. It's really great to see you here. I am Garrett Knapp. I am a faculty member in Urban Studies and Planning and the Director of National Center for Smart Growth. On behalf of the programs in Architecture, Studies and Planning and Real Estate Development and the entire School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, really pleased to see you all here. This is the opening of Makeover Montgomery 5. It is the 5th edition of a jointly organized program by the National Center for Smart Growth and the Maryland National Park and Planning Commission, or Montgomery County Planning Department, which I will refer to as Montgomery County. What was once a clever way to capture indirect cost and end-of-year money has turned into, blossomed into a multi-year celebration of planning excellence in the northern suburbs of Washington, D.C. I know I speak for all members of the organizing committee, certainly on behalf of the National Center for Smart Growth and Montgomery County planning staff, in expressing excitement that you are here and that we are anxiously anticipating tonight's keynote address, as well as a slate of activities as going to be held at the Montgomery County, the new Montgomery County headquarters in Wheaton, Maryland, over the next 2 days. Sorry. So we hope to see you there as well. That will start at 9 o'clock tomorrow. The address is, somebody help me out? 2425 Reedy Drive. Plug that into your GPS now so you can get there on time at 9 o'clock tomorrow. So the theme of this year's Makeover Montgomery 5 is resilience. Both are in terms of the economic, social, environmental, and public health realms. Resilience is defined in many ways, but one can define it as the ability of a system to recover from adverse shocks or irregular events. And while some might view resilience as a new catchy planning term, it's hard to imagine something more relevant today. If you think about the recent shocks that we have experienced, there was the murder of George Floyd, and the great social awakening in terms of interest and awareness of racial inequality. There is the changing climate, where we've seen manifest in wildfires, in heat waves, in flooding, and in sea level rise all across the country. In the past few years, we have seen changes in economics so that the supply side impediments left over from the pandemic has caused rapid inflation, as well as severe labor shortages, and of course the pandemic itself, which has caused the death of millions of people all around the world, and sickness everywhere else, and certainly new protocols in terms of public health. So these are shocks that present planners and other custodians of the built environment with significant challenges that we are going to face over the next few years. And I'm excited to hear what we and others are doing about this over the next 2 days and in tonight's keynote address. But before introducing tonight's keynote speaker, I just want to say a few words of thanks. I want to thank all my MAP colleagues. The School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation has been extremely supportive of the National Center for Smart Growth for a very long time, and has always been supportive of this Makeover Montgomery event. I want to thank my staff, in particular, Nick Finio, Linda Dunn, and Gerard Bullen for doing all the hard work to make this possible, as well as staff over at Montgomery County Planning as well. But in particular, I want to thank the leadership and the staff of Montgomery County Planning. Because this is a time of transition, both at Montgomery County Planning and the National Center for Smart Growth, I want to thank the Montgomery County Planning Department, express my gratitude for years of collaborative and partnership for many years. No one gets to graduate school without hearing about and learning about the pioneering things done by the Montgomery County Planning Department. And they've been extremely supportive to us. They have, for example, hired our graduate interns. They have hired many graduates of the National Center for Smart Growth and the Urban Studies and Planning program. It's almost viewed as a ladder to Montgomery County when you are a graduate student. at the University of Maryland. They have always been extremely helpful and provided us with access to data and maps and so forth. While that may seem trivial to some of you, that's really quite a big deal. And we get nowhere near the cooperation from many other planning departments that we get from Montgomery County Planning. They've been extremely supportive of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, which you'll hear more about over the next few days. They've been good friends. We've had many a happy hour with our colleagues in Montgomery County Planning, and that's just one of the real pleasures of working with them. So I want to thank Montgomery County Planning, the leadership and the staff, and special thanks to Gwen Wright, the director of the planning program, and Jason Sartori, who isn't here, but has always sort of had one foot in Montgomery Planning and one foot at the National Center for Smart Growth. But you didn't come to hear me talk. So now I want to introduce tonight's speaker. Angela D. Brooks is the president-elect and the past chair of the Diversity Task Force at the American Planning Association. She has over 20 years of experience as a professional planner and has worked professionally and personally to advance the fortunes of the underserved, the disadvantaged, and the underrepresented population. Currently, Ms. Brooks is the director of the Illinois Office of the Corporation of Supportive Housing. Did I get that right? Terrific. A nonprofit CDFI that seeks to transform the provision of affordable housing, not only in Chicago, but across the country. She spent a lot of time working in places all over the country. I overlearned at dinner and once applied to the University of Maryland Planning Program. So please join me in welcoming Angela D. Brooks.
Good evening, and I just want to say thank you for inviting me to kick off your Makeover Montgomery event. You know, we were talking a little bit at dinner, and I was telling them that when I moved to Chicago, I was actually trying to get to this area. I got to Chicago first, and now I can't afford to live here. So a lot of my comments will probably be around that, and certainly always really excited to talk to students. And I won't say how many years, but several years since I've been a student, but certainly always was excited to hear from practitioners talking about the work that they do, and certainly hope that at the end I'll give you guys my contact information, but want to invite you to keep in touch. Part of my platform in running for president for APA is to really look at the next generation of planners and ensuring that there's access and opportunity for all of you in the ways that I was very beneficial. I benefited a lot from mentors, so I want to make sure I extend that to all of you. So as mentioned, I am president-elect of the American Planning Association, but I'm also a houser. So I've spent the majority of my career ensuring that affordable housing is focused for cities and counties across the country. The work that I do now is in permanent supportive housing, doing a lot of work on housed, which certainly we're at a housing crisis in this country, but if it's a crisis for me and you, it's certainly going to be a crisis for those who are making 0 to 30% of the median. So your theme is on resiliency. I will talk a little bit about a lot, although titled it housing. I will talk a little bit about resiliency throughout. And it's important. Communities, both large and small, need to be resilient, not just to survive, but to also thrive. And in the work that I do, we do a lot of talking about thriving. We don't want just people to live. We want them to thrive and be very successful in the places that they live. And we all know resiliency really does start at home. So the fundamental focus of my life is that everybody has a right to safe, secure, and affordable housing. Right? That's the fundamental mission of my life. I say it over and over again. It's on the wall at work. And housing should be an asset to your health. It shouldn't negatively impact it. We certainly know that where you live determines your health and your life outcomes, but we also know that it should not. Housing should provide access to opportunity, not just a select few in targeted areas. And everybody should benefit from investments in housing and communities. And there's not one size fits all solution to addressing housing needs across this country. As planners and potential planners, we know that there have been inequitable practices that have perpetuated harm by our profession. But knowing and understanding those actions means we can move forward and we can ingrain equity in our actions, especially in housing. And at this point, I should mention that I'm super excited about the work that Montgomery County is doing around equity. I think you guys are a leader in some of the work that you're doing. I'll Also excited you guys read the APA Equity Guide. Never sure if people read those things, so glad not only are you reading it, but you're also implementing it. And I encourage you to make sure that you're submitting conference proposals and really highlighting the work that you do, because you are on the forefront of that, and that's something to be commended. So thank you for your work in that space. According to the CDC, in 2021, the average US life expectancy has dropped for the second year in a row. We as a country now experience the biggest 2-year decline in life expectancy since 1921 to 23. How do we create a built environment that promotes health and well-being and not one that harms its residents and shortens their lifespans? One is by using the built environment to increase physical activity in an equitable and inclusive way. APA is currently working with the CDC and has released the Everyday Destination series. Has anyone seen that? I hadn't either, so don't worry. This research work identifies 15 planning approaches that can be implemented to create new networks of accessible and inclusive destinations or reimagine existing destinations with approaches such as building on community living assets, advancing active living through adaptive reuse, and green space improvements to promote destination connectivity. This is something I hadn't thought a whole lot about until we started working on this presentation, and that's urban heat redlining. We also must use the built environment to reduce the impacts of climate change. Urban heat is the #1 weather-related killer in the United States. Not tornadoes, not hurricanes, not flooding, not earthquake, but urban heat. Due to decades of disinvestment, communities have uneven exposure to heat and city. Lower quality housing stock is often less energy efficient since it's more expensive to cool. A study of 108 urban areas in 2020 found that the formerly red line neighborhoods, which we all know tend to be Black and brown, were hotter than non-red line neighborhoods by an average of 5 degrees, and in some instances, nearly 13 degrees. As planners, we can help lead the efforts with our colleagues to implement heat mitigation strategies to cool our communities and reduce the risk of heat-related illnesses and death. Urban heat mitigation strategies can include urban greening, such as reforestation, vegetated parks and open spaces, green stormwater infrastructure, and green roofs and walls. These tactics are a few ways communities can bring the temperature down. And here in Montgomery County, I do see you guys have your canopy program. And so again, shout out to you guys for the work that you're doing and, making sure you're highlighting that so people are aware of these programs that are existing in the state. I did want to give a few examples, not local here, and that's in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Has anyone ever been there? Okay, I have not. It goes to you. Anyway, they have the Cedar Rapids Relief Program, which is a direct response to the city losing 50 to 60% of their tree canopy. That's nearly 700,000 trees due to a catastrophic weather event, a windstorm. Gusts of equivalent winds of about a F3 tornado, which is probably about 200 miles per hour winds. Among the goals of the relief program is beyond rebuilding the city's tree canopy, but it also aims to eliminate climate change, increase social equity, and educate the community about the importance of tree canopies. Who thought about tree canopies who doesn't do that for a living? Anybody here kind of focused on that in their studies? Okay, there we go. Raise your hand, be proud of that. In the past year, nearly 1,000 trees were planted as a part of phase 1. A grant from the US Forest Services will help plant another 1,000 trees in underserved neighborhoods. This public-private partnership between the city and Trees Forever is a 10-year prioritized plan to restore and plant a resilient tree canopy. More communities may have the opportunity to enhance their tree canopies. The Inflation Reduction Act allocated $1.5 billion, let me repeat that, $1.5 billion to the US Forest Service for the urban and community forestry program to help combat climate change. APA, of course, endorsed this provision as a way to help mitigate urban heat impacts. Another urban heat mitigation approach is the New York City's Cool Neighborhoods program. During a typical summer day, Black asphalt roofs and reach temperatures up to 190 degrees Fahrenheit. This is 90 degrees hotter than the surrounding air temperature. Core Roofs program is designed to help reduce energy use. Coating roofs with a type of reflective white paint can reduce internal building temperatures by up to 30%. Additionally, for every 2,500 square feet of roof coated, it can reduce the city's carbon footprint by 1 ton carbon dioxide. When the program started in 2019, it was volunteer-based. In 2015, it transitioned into a workforce development training opportunity, providing training, education, paid work, and credentials in the construction sector to New Yorkers. And these are the types of partnerships that really tie in the work that we do with economic development and community development. In total, 9.2 million square feet of rooftops have been painted. Housing is more than just ensuring individuals have a healthy or safe place. Location and affordability are also important factors into making community robust, productive, and most importantly, prosperous. In 2019, it was estimated that 75% of residential land in the country was zoned for single-family residences. This has led to both a shortage of available and financially affordable housing. Residents move further away from the city and to find affordable housing. As we all know, this results in urban sprawl and places of greater emphasis on the use of personal automobiles to get to jobs, schools, stores, especially if transit isn't a serious option. Housing is crucial, and we all know we're in short supply. So out of, how many people in here have cars? So APA recently sponsored or co-sponsored a housing underproduction report, Up for Growth. And they're having a conference on Tuesday here in DC. So if you're available, they told me to put that plug in. I saw them yesterday. Among the findings, currently the US has a shortfall of 3.79 million units of housing. 3.79 million units of housing. In 2012, the US was showing a shortfall of just 1.6 million units. This is not a coastal problem. It's now being experienced in 47 states and Washington, DC. Of the 309 metro areas in the United States, 169 are underproduced and 75 more are trending toward being underproduced. Maryland is also included in underproduction of housing units. In 2012, the shortfall was about 42,500. Now it's up to almost 92,000 units. Again, we are in a national crisis. With that said, one of APA's key priorities continues to focus on zoning reform and housing opportunity. There's no one-size solution to zoning reform. However, solutions do need to be unique to the community, but they need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed now. And what works in one community may not be the best option for another community, but we need to be working together to figure out what that is. And the most thing I always have to highlight is the solutions have to be equitable. This is an opportunity to further advance equity through planning efforts. Additionally, effective planning-led reform and efforts will improve the economy. When reforms are successful, people have access to better quality housing, better options, and better opportunities. Housing infrastructure funding brings communities greater returns on that investment. Talked a little bit about how many of us have cars, so this next little section might be a little bit iffy on us. I know I have an opinion on this that isn't always aligned with what planners should be doing, but here we go. Again, let's just kind of look at what kind of housing types. How many of you live in apartments? Condos? Townhouses? Anybody live in a tiny home? I was kind of hoping, because I'm really curious about that. Any other kind of housing type of single family houses? Any other housing types I'm kind of missing? Oh yeah, duplex. So let's just do a little history lesson. How many of you know why or how single family zoning emerged? How many of us want to talk about it? So single family emerged quietly as a way to help achieve racial segregation. That's just a fact. And through zoning, communities could exclude lower income groups who could not afford that much land or housing. Further, it kept lower income residents from accessing high quality resources and opportunities. Several communities across the country have moved forward in single-family zoning regulations. Oregon, California, Minneapolis, and even Lander, Wyoming. Have you ever heard of that? Okay, I was looking at you. Lander, Wyoming has a population of 7,500 people. And they've begun to rethink and are rethinking single-family residential zones. Oregon state law in 2019 ended single-family zoning regulation. Now, smaller Oregon cities must allow duplexes in areas that once zoned exclusively for single-family housing. Oregon cities larger than 25,000 people must allow duplexes, as well as townhouses, triplexes, and fourplexes. The conversation is not just about zoning, it's about equity too. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, so I do understand you guys are using great use of the current planning for equity guide, but we're also now APA, we're now finalizing a new policy guide called Equity in Zoning. I think that'll be a great interest to Montgomery County, as well as other communities around the country. The guide will summarize the history of zoning, and it will also create tools in driving inequities in communities and focuses on identifying solutions and opportunities for reform. One of the things I was talking about with you folks earlier is I recently was appointed to the Zoning Board of Appeals for Chicago. And I was reading the draft zoning, equity and zoning guide on the plane here. And I realized 90% of the work that I do on the zoning board is exactly opposite of what we're suggesting we should be doing in the zoning for equity. And the example I used is there was a piece of property that, for whatever reason, is no longer developable per our code. So the owner needed to do a variance, no fault of their own, they bought it at this size. They needed variance, so they had to come to the Zoning Board of Appeals. Generally speaking, that means you have to get an architect, keep building a house, you would need that anyway. But a lawyer, all of these things. So a lot of money is spent to get to this point. Yet, we had opposition. Neighbors on either side of the property didn't want it, not because they shouldn't have expected the house to go there, because there was a house there before. They'd gotten used to the green space that they probably are using for their cookouts and whatever it might have you. The Zoning Board of Appeals meeting started at 9 and the opponents who were opposing it were there. We didn't get to their agenda item until 3 p.m. Do any of you have that much time to sit on a zoning board meeting? I get a stipend, so I can sit there all day. But if I was a general, if I was a general public member, because I couldn't tell them what time that we were going to get to their case. We had 40 items on our docket. The fact that we have 40 items on the docket is a whole nother issue, but we won't go there. So I just wanted to kind of give an example of the type of things we're looking to do with that zoning policy guide or zoning reform policy guide. And hopefully, as students, some of you can take a look at it when it comes out. Please feel free to give your comments and practitioners and academics. I'm sure we'll be able to get some really good feedback from some of you as well. Anyway, on to eliminating parking minimums. Minimum on-site parking requirements create a significant barrier to multifamily housing. Don Shop of UCLA, and you might have heard or even seen or read his book, The High Cost of Free Parking, estimates that the US has set aside 2 billion parking spaces for just 250 million cars in light trucks. This results in far more land dedicated to cars than housing. We need to prioritize housing people over parking cars. And I'm someone who drives the majority of the time other than to and from work. So I say that understanding that. Eliminating parking minimums is not just for the large metro areas. Sandpoint, Idaho, with a population of just about 9,000, has made significant strides in solving people first. The catalyst was the construction of a new bank in their historic downtown, which of course kicked in the new zoning requirements, which was going to require 200 new parking spots. But the population of the city was just under 9,000. Despite being a block away from a municipal lot, the city council, not without debate, cut the bank's requirement in half. This, along with the historic building's interior remodel that triggered the new parking minimum, helped get the community talking about what its parking minimums realistically needed to be. So Sandpoint used those two items to do a few things. They eliminated parking minimums in downtown entirely. They significantly reduced minimums for commercial and residential properties elsewhere in the city, and they instituted parking maximums. This is the type of zoning reform that can help decrease high housing costs by promoting development, and other communities have used it as a powerful economic development tool. We also have to take a look at our building codes and bulk regulations. such as minimum lot size, maximum height, and maximum floor area ratio as other impediments to expanding housing options and availability. And we have to ensure our policies really do encourage a diversity of housing types that house all types of family needs and individual needs. Diversity of housing. LEAP community in Boise, Idaho is using shipping containers for converted homes as a pilot. They include solar to help reduce the cost of ownership. Has anybody been to a solar home or a solar commercial building? My spin gym is in a converted. It's interesting. That's an interesting experience. ADUs, that requires removing regulatory and financial barriers. We also need to consider how to keep these housing units affordable. I'm originally from Seattle, Washington, and ADUs and density isn't really helping affordability. So we might have missed the mark in some areas, but we're still ahead of the mark in others. Adding missing middle housing can take many formats, as you can see in this slide here. And we have to be creative on how we add this housing into our unit. And on the bottom, we have some different links, and I think maybe you can probably make these slides available. Perfect. Adaptive reuse. I'm sure we all hear a lot about that. Adaptive reuse is another way that communities convert existing buildings and housing structures that are no longer needed into multifamily housing or other uses. This approach emphasizes preservation or rehabilitation of existing buildings and uses. Any of us in my previous life, I was a real estate developer, and to develop in Chicago at least, to develop an affordable unit takes me about 7 years for new construction. To convert or readapt a building probably could be done in less than a year. To utilize this approach, communities need to look at their zoning and building regulations, as they can be barriers to adaptive reuse. One example of adaptive reuse in Massachusetts helped to address a housing need for the unhoused, especially at the height of the pandemic, and a lot of cities did this as well. In Brockton, an underused hotel was transformed into 69 units of permanent supportive housing. This was a public-private effort, using financial resources from the state's Department of Housing and Community Development, combined with financial support from quasi-public community development funds that helped the nonprofit Father's Bill in Mainspring convert an underused roadway in. CSH, who I work for, is also a CDFI. I know in California, we're doing a lot of funding for hotel conversions, hotel and motel conversions for unhoused. Combined with financial resources, a zoning tool called the Dover Amendment helped expedite the process. This amendment exempts nonprofit organizations providing educational services from land use and dimensional requirements. This allowed the homeless service to quickly source its building permit without the need for public process. Can't even imagine that. Now is the time to take action. We do not have the luxury of time. In approximately 7 years, our underproduction of housing units has more than doubled. We need to start implementing strategies and solutions in communities near and far to solve our housing crisis. The good news is now more than ever, we have a variety of federal funding support that communities can tap into. Has anybody, those of you who are practitioners, has anybody been using their ARPA funds for housing unit creation? Awesome. The bipartisan infrastructure law includes support for housing coordination plans that can improve the connection between land use and planning and transportation. MPOs, or metropolitan planning organizations, have an opportunity to ensure these components reflect the planning principles. And earlier this year, the Biden administration unveiled its Housing Supply Action Plan, which encourages locally driven reforms to zoning and land use policies. I don't know if I'm the only planning nerd in the room, but when I heard the president talking about zoning, I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. I didn't even care if I agreed with what he said. He just said zoning. That doesn't happen often. And this really focuses on incentivizing land use and zoning reform and reducing regulatory barriers. Communities demonstrating progress on local housing reforms will be given weight in federal grant-making process for certain US DOT and US EDA grants, Economic Development Administration grants, piloting new financing for housing production and preservation, new financing tools for ADUs, and boosting rural single-family construction. It also improves expanding existing federal financing, preserving the availability of affordable single-family homes for owner occupants, as well as encouraging including the use of CDBG funds. We all know we don't get enough of it. So part of the reason I'm in DC now is APA is doing a congressional fly-in to really focus on two really important bills that are bipartisan. The first is the Housing Supply and Affordability Act. Certainly encourage all of you to reach out to your legislature. Let both reps and senators encourage their support of this act. This will provide dedicated planning grants to help communities build out housing action plans and implementation grants, which is super important. We always have these lofty goals and plans, but all of us know when it's time to implement them, you need funds, particularly in our smaller and rural jurisdictions that don't have a robust staff. So this grant will help put the plans into action. This legislation is unlike any other in Congress and would empower planners in communities they support to advance local housing solutions. Planners, we're the leaders in this fight, but we can't do it alone. We need stakeholder support, community engagement. So as you work through your own county's housing concerns, few key pointers to put in mind. When you start talking about change, people can get a little bit anxious. They can get resistant and get angry. I'm sure all of us have a wonderful public meeting story that we can share. We won't do that to you students because you have something to look forward to. It really is amazing. But no one really likes change. Help engage in meaningful conversations about solving community housing crisis. Few key pointers that we've been kind of talking about from the APA front about reframing the conversation. And these were recently in effect. First of all, how many of you have read the planning magazine? Anybody? I'm gonna work on that before I come again. But anyway, so these are kind of the tips that we gave. So avoid the use of jargon or professional lingo. And I know I'm super guilty of that. Words such as density, multifamily, upzoning, infill development. These can cause community members to feel excluded. Also, they won't know what you're talking about. And then the terminology can also incite fear due to the negative connotations that have been associated with all of those words. How many of you have ever heard, I don't want those renters, or fearing multifamily and what that's going to bring? So when you use those words, you automatically start a connotation of negativity that you're not necessarily looking for. And you've automatically set the community to be in an opposition position of something they actually might agree with. Present zoning changes as a way to offer new housing choices or options, not limiting existing ones. And then focus on form and scale, not density and metrics. And lastly, share images that help the community understanding what the missing middle looks like and who that might be. I think often when we talk about affordable housing, there's a wide scope of what affordable housing is and who it is. Most of you, when you come out of school and get your first planning job, are going to meet the definition of someone who needs an affordable housing unit. It is what it is. Work on that too. But I think it's just really important that we reframe those conversations and really show who it is that are impacted. Because the average person that people are scared to look like that's going to live next to them isn't who you're talking about. Not saying that that's also not problematic, but the reality is who we're serving generally is a child, a teacher, a firefighter, the Trader Joe's worker, the people that service their industry. People complain about traffic, not allowing the missing middle or even the higher tier affordable housing. We're not even going to deal with the stuff I work with daily. You're causing traffic because they have to live 30 and 40 minutes away. And so we really have to think about what do we want our communities to look like? What does resiliency look like to you? For me, a resilient community is a community where everybody who lives there, can work there, they can play there, and they can do the things, because we really do have to think about, I live on the south side of Chicago. I drive pretty much everywhere to do what I want to do, because there aren't a lot of amenities in my community, and that's not okay. And so as we rethink our plans and the things that we want to go into communities, we have to think about having equitable communities for all. Lastly, my contact information. We need to work together to address our nation's housing crisis so we can be more resilient and a stronger country and a really great place for all of us to live. Thank you for your time. I think we have some time for some questions now. And yeah. really proud of myself about the QR code. I just want to say I'm a little bit old, so I'm really excited.
Questions, please. Experiences, reactions, thoughts, provocative presentation.
No worry.
Don't worry. I was curious to know what zoning tool or other type of tool, financial tool, have you encountered that works best in generating housing opportunities?
I have to answer that, I'd be rich. No, seriously, I think one of the things that I've done a lot in my previous career is, I work for the Housing Authority, so it's a little skewed when you work for a government agency, certainly. But I think one of the things that we really worked on was minimizing the time for building permits. So not a zoning tool, but definitely a tool, and expediting. But again, that can be really expensive, so I work for a government agency, so it's easier for our developers, but the average person, that isn't very helpful. So I think one of the things that I personally am a proponent of is looking at what are we requiring variances for? What are we requiring special use permits for? Is that necessary? Because you're adding in time, but you're also adding in process and extra levels of bureaucracy. Because I think some of our zoning codes, we might change sections, but when was the last time we did an overhaul of zoning codes? Most of them are outdated, so we haven't looked at anything innovative. So I think that would be the first step I suggest for anyone to really look at. Are we asking for things in 2022 that still need to be asked for? Are there some things that we know theoretically and in practice that should be absolutely permitted outright? That would be my first kind of thing.
Many of the people that are fighting development or housing are, self-proclaimed progressives. How do you reach them? How do you convince them? They may have a Black Lives Matter sign in the front yard, but their housing policies or views on development may not be in line with that. So how do you tackle that, at least in your neighborhood? And have you been successful in kind of changing people's minds?
Did everybody hear that question? Okay. I was trying to stall and repeat it. So, I do think that's a very, very valid point. I certainly think that the social media world has certainly identified the progressives or the Karens of the world and the anti-developers who are theoretically progressive. So I think the biggest thing for me, and certainly in my career of doing permanent supportive housing and public housing specifically, I've certainly seen a lot of that, is just really having a robust community process. And although that doesn't help, because I certainly have been to some pretty racist type community meetings in progressive areas, particularly on you're building libraries. I worked for a housing authority, libraries, who knew? But we were doing a library in a pretty progressive area that was going to have housing on tile. Again, I worked for the housing authority, we were building a library and they didn't want those people there. But you want this library. So I think one of the things we really had to do a lot of community outreach and really talk about who it is that was living there. It was particularly hard for me as a Black woman because those people are those people. And it was definitely for students, there are going to be these professional challenges, particularly if you're a minority, if you're gender, any of these things where you are going to be in a very awkward situation. So I'm going to tell you, I'm a pretty direct person, so I had to pull it in. But, I think really just working on this is why we're doing it, this is what it is, and just sticking to the facts of the case. Because at the end of the day, in my instance, most of the time I'm doing things that are permitted outright, and it's going to happen anyway. So, it just is what it is. So like, hey, you may not want this, but what would work for you? And then just really working with people, really get people in the room, because I think the loudest person on the mic isn't always the majority. And so having to be very intentional in those meetings, like I've had meetings where we've paid for buses to make sure our residents came to the meetings. We've definitely planted people. I've had friends come in, I'm like, don't wear your suit, dress down a little bit, here's what you read. I mean, I'm not saying it's right, but you gotta get it done the way you get it done. So, but I think also, and this is something I'm particularly challenged with in my current role and then working for a government entity, is the letters to the editor and Twitter. So I may not be able to say certain things, but making sure there are people responding to those. Because I think it's really bold to be on a computer in a closed meeting, but now that things are being streamed and things are online, I think it's a lot more helpful. Because nobody wants to admit that they're a racist bigot, and their coworkers might see, oh my God forbid, their Black friend or their colleagues see that. So those are the types of things, but there's no real answer for that. Because there are a lot of progressive people who really aren't progressive when it comes to housing law. And you certainly will see that now that the unhoused are starting to be way more visible. So in the work I do now, certainly some of the comments I get, particularly around clearing out temporary housing solutions and tents, become quite problematic. If somebody has a solution on that, I definitely email me that. 'Cause I deal with that pretty regularly.
We had a couple projects in Montgomery County. One was the state can transfer surplus land, state highway to the county. And it can be for transportation use. So it was determined that a firehouse was a transportation use because they rescue people in car accidents. But also proposed was the housing opportunities in the back of the firehouse. I'm not sure you want to live next to a firehouse. But they were proposing a building, and I guess Gwen is familiar with that. But it's been short-circuited because, well, can we put housing on a transferred land? So again, you need to look at the regulations and try to get them changed. We had another example. We have a housing authority. They do affordable rentals. It was on down on off MacArthur Boulevard near the Potomac River. It was a linear building. Kind of one story on one side, the land went down, so it's 2 stories here. And my master's thesis in planning was based on the Hemisphere project where they built a whole hotel in San Antonio with modular units and said, well, maybe you could bring in modular units for families with more than, husband and wife perhaps, or 2 children, but 3 to 4 children, you would need an extra bedroom and a bath, and put them in perpendicular. And the pushback was, well, that's what we need, another parking space. But you're talking about shrinking in particular situations, the requirement for parking. So we in Montgomery County, we're very progressive, but we do still have some impediments to moving ahead.
Yeah, I've certainly had to reframe my thinking on modular homes. I went to school in the South, so it was very commonplace. And I used to be pretty anti that, but I mean, it really is a great
We
solution.
had one case in Rockville, I'm coming back in the senior center, single family home. And they came in for the whole unit, put it on top of the house and made it a, 2-story or 2-family home.
And we're seeing a lot of that in Chicago for sure, even on the multifamily level. Skinder, I don't think they're doing it now, but they were doing a lot of huge unit. I mean, just easier, it's cheaper to construct and easier to do at scale. So it's definitely a huge solution on providing affordable solution for housing and commercial uses. In Seattle, the Seattle Girls School, I was up one night late and they drove the school up and plopped it down on the foundation. So, I see that's going to be a growing industry, and I'm sure it's going to be more and more common, and looking at how we look at codes to make it a little bit more accessible, because there are a lot of codes that still prevent that.
Yeah, as part of technology change, you look at shipping containers and all that with boxcars, but shipping. So it's almost the element there. You have sent shipping containers overseas to turn into housing. So
Yeah.
The questions? Go ahead.
I'll go here because you have a yellow and I can.
Thank you. I'm Clara Irazabala. I'm one of the planning professors here in the school. Thank you for your presentation. After hearing you, I'm very happy to know that you are the president-elect of APA, because we can go places with you. I want to bring it back to the topic of the conference, resilience. And we have all heard that resilience is usually defined as bouncing back to the condition before a crisis or before a disaster. But there's a healthy debate that argues that it shouldn't be the case, that resilience should be bouncing forward to the sustainable and equitable future that we deserve and we aspire for. That is not something that existed in the past. So I wonder where you stand in that conception of resilience. What do you think are the barriers that prevent us from moving in that transformational direction? And how can we overcome some of them?
Goodness. Yeah, you should have told me she was an academic. No. No, I do agree with you. I think when we think about resiliency, we should certainly be thinking about forward looking. I think as a profession, we need to start looking forward. I think certainly we have to look backwards to a certain degree, but I think how do we look futuristic about it? I do think that when I use the term resilience, I'm probably using it more in the same way that you are, but I do think generally people are not looking at that. And I think when you think about how do you reframe that, it's the whole thing is a profession. We have to reframe how we think about a lot of things. So it's really about one, and I didn't do it today, and I'm usually good about defining what I mean when I use a term. So there's that. But I think it's also really encouraging people to think about resiliency in a positive sense, because sometimes it does have a negative connotation when you look at it as bouncing back from something as bouncing forward. And maybe it's come up with a new term. So maybe you can come up with a new trending term for our field and work with our students so we can rebrand it and come up with a cooler name. I'm sure there's some cool students in here with some ideas that can help us.
It's right there. Okay. I'm an architect. I live in Silver Spring, which is on the east side of the Great Economic Divide, if you know anything about the area. I'm here this weekend because I'm very concerned about Thrive 2050, because I think it will impact the East County drastically, negatively. However, my question now relates to your comment about cars and minimal parking. Cars to me are a visual pollution. And the more cars you have, the more visually polluting they are. In the case of a residential area where you have, say, quarter acre, half acre, whatever lots, you generally have space for 1 or 2 cars. If you change zoning so that you do away with a minimal parking requirement, to what extent, if you end up infilling with, say, fourplexes, and you don't provide minimal parking for those, what I see happening is I see a visual pollution of more and more cars on, and not in front of places, on yards, on here and there, backed up 4 or 5 deep into a driveway. And I think that that kind of visual pollution is the kind of thing that people worry about, because that visual pollution of the cars often translates into a sense of this is lower income, whether or not that's the case. So I think it's wonderful to get rid of cars in an urban area or cars on Capitol Hill in terms of limited parking. I'm not so sure that what planners are doing, thinking about cars in residential areas and not taking that pollution into account.
So remember when I got to that slide, the first thing I said, I did my disclaimer. I personally, as a driver, probably lean towards you, but recognize, I recognize the hypocrite I can be in my own personal life and my own thoughts around that versus what we do as a profession. So my quick answer to that is really one size, it's not one size fits all. So certainly scale and community make a difference. But I do contend that particularly different generations need different things. So certainly I imagine a lot of the students here, I'll never be carless. I'll just admit it. I live 2 blocks from a train. I'm never going to be carless, but there are a generation of people who are. So we've got to look at where are those housing patterns. But I do think as we start reducing cars, and I don't like suburban communities that don't allow cars on the street. Like for me, that's a safety thing. I don't think about that as visual pollution. I think about eyes on the street. So when I go into some of my friends' neighborhoods and I'm parking and there's nobody out there, or when everybody's parking in a garage. So I think there's a conversation to be had for each community, but I don't think it's one way or the other. But I do recognize that in some communities that can be a challenge, but I certainly am imagining if you're in a townhouse and you've got 4 cars, even if you have, we're never going to require you to have 4 parking spots, so it doesn't solve for that. So I think it's always going to be an issue, and I think there's going to be a huge tug of war professionally around what that has to look like. And it's going to require some real big community processes wherever it is, but it's going to be an uncomfortable, difficult conversation no matter where we have it. Certainly a 1-for-1 in a multifamily building is no longer needed. We know that to be a fact in an urban area, but there are still multiple jurisdictions that still require 1-for-1 type parking requirements. So maybe you start there and you work your way down. So
I'm agreeing with you. I mean,
Yeah.
there's gotta be limits, but I'm just,
Yeah, I recognize in the non-urban, definitely
Every once in a while, you see 17 cars, and so help me, on the street the other day, that's what I saw, just about that number. A rental house, which is.
the sad thing is, we're never gonna require 17 parking spots, so you're still gonna see that.
And I. That's,
Yeah, I'm gonna let you hear.
I just wanted to respond. I live in a neighborhood where it's on-street parking. We don't have garages. And most people don't have driveways. But the beauty of it is it's safe because people drive slower. When you have cars parked on either side of the street, they can't go fast. You have to go slow because, if somebody's coming in one direction, I'm going the other. You have to find a place to pull over, and people drive really slow. And I think there are other benefits other than just the fact that, I just think you have to look at a holistic approach. And it feels comfortable for me to have cars on the street because it's safer in terms of walking and, your neighbors better because you're getting in your cars together. You're not going, from your house into your garage, into a box and driving somewhere. So I personally, I have a car, and I park on the street in front of my house and it's great. I know my neighbors. Yeah, I feel safe. I think it's great.
And I think developers are also recognizing. I mean, we approved a project, I think it was a 90-unit project that had no parking. In a pretty substantial building, and it's because of what you said. There's an entire generation that will never own a car. And with drive sharing services, it's not what it used to be. And I have 3 kids and we're a 1-car family. It used to be 2, if not more, right? People would have a backup car back in the day where if you knew that the other one wasn't working, you'd have another one. So things are changing, and I think the pandemic has also changed the way we commute with telework.
That commute across the hallway.
To distract from whatever that was. So I'm a student, I'm gonna be a planner in the future, same with other people around me. I was just curious, because you are like really cool.
I like to record that and tell my.
Like, what's, I guess, one piece of advice that you would like give students like us who are gonna be going out into the world soon, like this?
Be flexible. So when I was sitting in your seat, I was gonna be the planning director of a large city, and I've worked in one traditional planning job. And so I kind of went with the flow. So my first job, I finished graduate school. I went to University of New Orleans. I knew I didn't want to stay there. Moved home to Seattle, at our home loan bank for a while, got a little lending experience, and I interned with the county. Then I did a stint doing permitting for cell towers. Like, that's the least sexy job I've ever had in my life, but it was one of the most important jobs I ever had because it was a long time ago before everybody had a cell phone. But nobody wanted a cell phone tower. Like now, everybody wants a cell phone, so it's a little bit easier. But I met more NIMBYs. Like I was on the other side of the counter, so I got to experience the implication of implementing planning. But I also got a lot of experience writing telecommunications ordinances and actually getting permits. Didn't love it, certainly, but I pulled something from it. And then when I wasn't working as a planner, I served on the City of Seattle Planning Commission. When you're younger and you're coming out of school, or even when you're in school, get really involved in community organizations and planning boards. A lot of them want young adults, so if there's any of those programs, do that. And then ultimately, kind of while you're in school, and this is something I did not know, and if you're not graduating soon, learn numbers, take a budget class, learn how to read a pro forma. I don't think anybody should come out of planning school that can't read a pro forma, and I did it for a living and I hate it. But it's certainly important to know, because when a developer comes and they're telling you, I can't do this, and you can't read their pro forma, you don't have an argument. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're lying. So it's really important to understand the numbers. And regardless, at some point in your career, as you traject up, you're gonna have to do budgets. So like 60% of my job now is looking at budgets, and I didn't learn that in school. So I'm having to learn that on the back end, which is a lot more frustrating when I don't have a professor I can go do office hours with. I'm sitting there Googling stuff and asking my finance team who hate me. So those would be the things I would say. Be super flexible with your career. Take advantage of everybody in your class, keep in touch, create your network. I think you guys do that better than my generation in that regard. and just really support each other, but really, really, really don't leave school and don't understand the numbers.
You're here. One more question. Yep. One more question.
I'll let you pick.
Not you. One more
You're
question.
picking.
Yes.
On the topic of students, actually, I'm an architecture student, I'm an undergraduate. And I was wondering, how can we accommodate like from an architecture and smaller scale standpoint to include like planning or to like include innovations in planning or like help push forward nuances that say planners do, because from what I understand, like many times they're very disconnected, like the architecture side and the planning.
So I'm president-elect of the American Planning Association, so I'm the first Black woman that will be in that position, and AIA just selected their first Black woman who will be in that position, and we both are in Chicago. So we actually just had this conversation on how do we better work together as architects and planners. It was a running joke when I was in planning school that a lot of people were just people who couldn't get into architecture school, which is not the case in my case. But a lot of architects do planning work. I have a whole myriad of opinions on that we won't go into at this moment. So I think it is important that we do a better job of working together, because in the built environment, it's just not architects and planners, it's landscape architects, it's engineers. Like, we do need to do a better job of working together, and all of us really have an impact on each other. So as an architect, it's important for you, particularly when you're in school, to build those relationships, and you're designing stuff. So a planner may not fully understand, maybe those of you in design, it's not a thing, might understand how a policy is implementing what you do, but the vast majority may not. So just ensuring you're having those relationships. And then it's really important for architects to participate in the public process. Now that I'm on the zoning board, I see more architects participating, not because they're there as citizens, but they're there, they have to be, because we require all this foolishness for our boards. But I think it is important that architects participate in that, and we're very big contributors, as well as, I think, if you're still in school, taking some classes on the planning side is very helpful, to really kind of understand some of that. A lot of architects do master plans, but they don't do so great on the community engagement process. So, you know, you really should be working together on that piece. There's just certain skills each of us bring to the table that do much better together than independent.
It's 8 o'clock. We're gonna do a picture.